The door to Hazel Norris's apothecary swung open so hard it struck the wall behind it, rattling the rows of brown glass bottles on their shelves and sending a ripple of cold January air through the small shop. She did not flinch. She was already looking up from the mortar and pestle she had been working with, already reading the tension in the man's massive frame before he had taken a single step inside, and what she saw stopped the grinding motion of her wrist mid-stroke. Cecil Blackwell looked like a man who had walked through something terrible to get here. He was bigger than she had imagined, and she had imagined him plenty over the past 4 months, because everyone in Ridgecrest, Colorado had a story about Cecil Blackwell, and most of those stories ended with the phrase, "Hasn't come down from those hills since autumn." His dark beard was heavy with frost. His coat, a great canvas duster the color of iron-stained rock, was soaked through at the shoulders from snowmelt. His eyes, the color of pine bark in shadow, found her immediately across the cluttered room, and the look in them was not the look of a man who had come to buy tinctures or powders. It was the look of a man who had come for answers. "You sent for Dr. Aldrich," he said. His voice was low and rough, like gravel shifted by a cold creek. "You sent the letter in November and again in December, and when Aldrich didn't come you sent word to the marshal. I want to know why." Hazel set down the pestle. She straightened her spine to its full height, which was still considerably less than his, but she had never relied on height. "I sent for Dr. Aldrich because I needed a physician's authority to have a body exhumed," she said. "I need to know how your brother died, Mr. Blackwell, because I do not believe it was the fever." The silence that followed those words was the kind that had weight to it, the kind that pressed against the ears. His jaw tightened. A muscle moved beneath the frost-darkened skin of his cheek. "Thomas died of scarlet fever," he said, and there was a warning buried in those 5 words, a hidden fence line he was daring her to cross. "Thomas died 3 days after signing a revised land deed transferring his homestead to Everett Marsh," Hazel said, holding his gaze without blinking. "He was 28 years old. He had no prior history of illness that I am aware of, and he came to see me the morning before he died, Mr. Blackwell. He came to see me because he was afraid. Whatever fortress Cecil Blackwell had built around himself in those months on the mountain, she watched something crack in the wall of it." "What did he say?" The words came out barely above a whisper. "Sit down," Hazel said, "because what I have to tell you is going to change everything you thought you knew about what happened in October, and you are going to need your feet under you before you decide what to do about it." He sat, and she began. But to understand how Hazel Norris had arrived at this moment, you had to go back to the autumn before, to a September afternoon when the aspen groves on the hills above Ridgecrest were just beginning to bleed their yellow gold, and a woman with a medicine bag and a mind like a steel trap came riding into a town that did not quite know what to do with her. Ridgecrest, Colorado in the autumn of 1882 was a town still deciding whether it intended to survive. The silver rush that had punched it into existence 6 years prior had slowed to a trickle but not stopped entirely. The main street held a general store, a land office, a saloon that doubled as a hotel, a church that doubled as a schoolroom, and a smithy whose owner, Marcus Cole, was the most reliably sober man within 20 miles. There was no doctor. The last physician who had set up practice in Ridgecrest had succumbed to a bad winter, and worse, whiskey, 18 months prior, leaving a gap in the community that good intentions could not fill, and superstition was rapidly moving to occupy. Into that gap rode Hazel Norris on a bay mare named Prudence, with a leather satchel strapped across the saddle and 2 wooden crates of glass-stoppered bottles tied behind her, and she asked Marcus Cole where she might rent a building because she intended to open an apothecary. Marcus Cole looked her over once, in the frank assessing way of a man who valued function, and said, "The old print shop's been empty since spring. Talk to Ruth Alderman at the general store." Ruth Alderman also looked her over. Ruth's assessment took longer and carried more skepticism. "You trained as a pharmacist?" Ruth asked. "I trained under Dr. William Price of St. Louis for 3 years, Hazel said, and spent 2 years before that studying botanical medicine with a woman named Clara Baptiste, who knew more about healing with plants than any man I have ever encountered in a medical school. I can compound prescriptions, treat common injuries, diagnose most illnesses with a high degree of accuracy, and I have never lost a patient to my own error. I cannot perform surgery, and I do not pretend to be a physician, but I am the closest thing to one that you are going to get in this town for the foreseeable future. Ruth stared at her for a moment longer. Then she said, "The rent is $4 a month and Marcus will help you move those crates." Hazel set up her apothecary in a week. She cleaned the old print shop herself, removing decades of ink stains from the floorboards with lye soap and determination, constructing shelves from lumber she purchased at the mill on the south end of town, organizing her bottles and dried herbs, and compounding tools with a system that was entirely her own, born from years of learning that organization was the difference between helping someone and accidentally harming them. She was 26 years old, unmarried by deliberate choice rather than circumstance, and she had come to Ridgecrest because her mentor doctor, Price, had written to her in the spring with a letter describing the town's need for medical care and suggesting, with characteristic understatement, that it might present an opportunity for a woman of her particular tenacity. What he had not mentioned was Everett Marsh. Everett Marsh was the kind of man who arrived in frontier towns and proceeded to grow over them like kudzu over a fence. He had come to Ridgecrest 2 years prior with a land surveyor, and a lawyer and enough capital to make people nervous and interested in equal measure. He had purchased 2 mining claims outright, acquired a mortgage on the lumber mill, and was steadily, quietly pressing his influence into every significant piece of property in the valley, using a combination of legitimate purchase and what Hazel, within her first month in Ridgecrest, began to recognize as a very practiced form of predation. She first noticed it through her patients. Old Gerald Fenwick came in for a poultice for his swollen knee and mentioned, while she was mixing it, that he had signed papers transferring his water rights to Marsh in exchange for a cash sum that would cover his debts. His tone was the tone of a man who was not entirely sure he had understood what he had signed. Clara and Jim Morse, who ran the little cattle operation on the eastern bench, came in together for Jim's cough medicine and mentioned, carefully, that Marsh had approached them about buying their grazing land, and that the offer had felt less like an offer and more like a deadline. Thomas Blackwell had come in twice before the October morning that Hazel now described to his brother. The first time had been for a salve for a rope burn on his forearm, and he had been easy and talkative, a young man with his older brother's dark coloring but a lighter nature, quick to smile, obviously proud of the homestead he had built on the North Ridge. The second time he had come in quieter. There was something behind his eyes that had not been there before. "Is everything all right?" Hazel had asked because she was a woman who paid attention to the things people carried in their faces as much as the things they described in their symptoms. Thomas had hesitated. "Marsh has been out to see me twice now," he said, finally. "About the land. I've told him twice it's not for sale." "Good for you," Hazel said. Thomas had smiled at that briefly, but the worry hadn't left his eyes. The third time he came, the morning before he died, there was no smile at all. "I need you to remember something for me," Thomas Blackwell said, and he pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket and held it out to her. "I need you to hold on to this." Hazel had taken it. She had not opened it in front of him because his expression asked her not to. "Is there something I should know?" she said. "I signed papers yesterday," Thomas said. "Marsh sent his lawyer out to the homestead at supper time. There were 3 men with him. I don't know what I signed, Miss Norris. I don't know if what I signed is what they told me it was. I had my rifle, but there were 3 of them and I was alone, and he stopped. His voice had a tremor in it that was not illness, it was fear. I need someone to know, that's all. I need someone outside of Marsh's reach to know what happened." "Do you want me to go to the marshal with you?" she asked. Marshal Haynes takes his dinners at Marsh's table twice a week, Thomas said, which explained the hidden motive behind his secrecy, and confirmed to Hazel that the trap Thomas had walked into was far more carefully constructed than an ordinary land dispute. Thomas Blackwell died the next morning. The official story, delivered by the town's unofficial physician, a man named Dr. Peter Albright, who had arrived in Ridgecrest around the same time as Marsh, and who Hazel privately considered far more invested in Marsh's interests than in his patient's, was scarlet fever. Swift onset, fatal by morning. Hazel had seen scarlet fever. She had treated it, managed it, understood its progression. She also knew that a man healthy enough to walk 2 miles into town and hold a coherent, frightened conversation in the morning did not die of scarlet fever the same night. She had opened the folded paper after she heard the news. It was a copy. Thomas had made a copy of the land deed he had signed, in his own hand, laborious and careful, with the actual language of the document recorded faithfully. What the deed said was not what Thomas had reportedly been told it said. The deed did not transfer a small section of his east boundary in exchange for debt relief. It transferred the entire homestead, all 140 acres, the cabin, the water rights, the timber, and the mineral claims attached to the land. And the deed was dated October 15th, 3 days before Thomas Blackwell was dead. Marsh had taken possession of the property quietly and quickly, citing a pre-existing debt arrangement that no one in town had ever heard Thomas mention, because Thomas Blackwell had never been a man with financial troubles. His brother had made sure of that. Cecil Blackwell, the mountain man who had not come down from the hills since autumn. Everyone in Ridgecrest knew the broad outlines of Cecil Blackwell's life the way frontier people knew the outlines of their landscape, with familiarity but not intimacy. He was 31 years old and had been living on the high ridge above town since he built his cabin there 6 years ago. He came down periodically to trade, to resupply, to check on his younger brother. He was not antisocial exactly, but he was a man who had clearly decided that the company of mountains was preferable to the company of most people, and most people respected that in the way they respected other forces of nature, at a distance. He had come down for Thomas's funeral. He had stood at the graveside looking like something carved from the cliff face behind him, and people had spoken to him in quiet, careful voices, the way you spoke carefully around something powerful that had not yet determined its direction. He had gone back up the mountain the next day, and that was the last anyone had seen of him. And when Hazel asked Ruth Alderman if anyone had been up to check on him through November and December, Ruth had looked at the floor and said people figured he needed his time. Hazel had written to Dr. Aldrich in the next county, a legitimate and credentialed physician whose authority could compel an exhumation, because she could not conduct one herself. She had written twice and received no response, which she did not believe was coincidence. She had written to the county marshal, who had sent a brief reply citing lack of jurisdiction and suggesting she address her concerns locally, which was precisely useless given that the local marshal shared meals with the man she suspected of murder. What she had not done, and had been debating with herself through the long, cold weeks of December, was write to Cecil Blackwell directly. She had avoided it for reasons that she was honest enough with herself to examine. She had avoided it because she was not certain she could reach him without the letter being intercepted, because she did not know what a grieving and potentially volatile man would do with the information she carried, and because she had, somewhere in the course of those 4 months, developed a complicated and inconvenient feeling about a man she had never actually met. It had started with Thomas's stories. Thomas talked about his brother the way people talked about landmarks, with a casual reverence that suggested he genuinely believed Cecil was part of the landscape. Cecil says the snowpack on the North Ridge tells you everything you need to know about the spring, Thomas had told her once. Cecil can read the weather in the bark of a pine tree. Cecil had taught Thomas to trap and to hunt and to read a contract. that last skill apparently not having proven sufficient protection against a lawyer with 3 armed men. She had built a picture of Cecil Blackwell from those fragments, and it was a picture of a man who was competent and quiet and loyal to the things he cared about with a ferocity that the mountain had not diminished. She was not a woman who needed a man. She wanted to be clear about that, if only to herself. She had built her independence with as much care and intention as she had built her apothecary, and she was not about to dismantle it for romance. But there was something about the portrait of Cecil Blackwell that made her think, in her more honest moments, that a man like that might be the rare kind who would not ask her to. She had sent no letter. January had arrived, brutal and white, and she had continued her work, treating frostbite and coughs and the ordinary machinery of a small frontier community, and she had kept Thomas's copied deed locked in the false bottom of her medicine chest, and she had tried to decide what to do about Everett Marsh without walking into the same trap Thomas had walked into. And then Cecil Blackwell had come down from the mountain. Now he sat across from her in her apothecary, his massive frame incongruous on the small wooden stool she had offered him, his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped between them, listening without interrupting as she laid out everything she knew. She had not softened it. She did not believe in softening things when the unvarnished version was necessary for someone to act correctly on the information. She placed Thomas's copied deed on the counter between them. Cecil looked at it without touching it for a long moment. "He made a copy," he said. "He was frightened and he was careful," Hazel said. "He was your brother." Cecil's jaw worked. He picked up the paper finally, unfolded it, read it with the slow, deliberate attention of a man who had been taught to read contracts. She watched his expression and learned something from it. It did not collapse into grief or erupt into anger. It went very still, the way a forest went still before a serious storm, everything holding its breath before the release. "Albright wrote the death certificate," he said. "Yes, Albright is Marsh's man. I believe so. And Haynes." "Almost certainly." Cecil set the paper down. "Why did you write to Aldrich and not to me?" It was the right question, asked without accusation, which told her something about the quality of his mind. "Because I wasn't sure I could reach you safely," she said. "And because I didn't know what you'd do." "What did you think I'd do?" She met his eyes. "Ride down the mountain with that rifle and walk into Marsh's saloon and solve the problem with your hands, which would result in you being dead within a week, and the only witness to your brother's fear being discredited or silenced." The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was the acknowledgement of a fair assessment. "So what's your plan?" he asked. "I have a plan," she said. "It requires patience, a good lawyer, and someone with enough legal standing to compel the county court to investigate the land deed. You are Thomas's heir. You have standing. I haven't been to a courthouse in 6 years. I know, that's about to change." Cecil looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "You've been sitting on all of this since October," he said. "4 months. Someone had to," she said simply. "You could have sent word to me in November and let me handle it." "With respect, Mr. Blackwell, I'm handling it. I asked for your help because I need your legal standing and your testimony, not because I need someone to take it off my hands." Another of those long, assessing silences. Then he said, "Who taught you to talk like that?" "Like what?" "Like a lawyer and a doctor at the same time." "My mother," she said, and there was something in her voice that briefly admitted it before she closed it off. "And several years of not being taken seriously, which is an excellent education in precision." He nodded once, as though that answer confirmed something he'd already suspected. "All right," he said. "Tell me the plan." Over the next hour, Hazel walked him through it with the systematic clarity that she applied to everything. She had already drafted a legal complaint citing the suspicious timing of Thomas's death relative to the land deed transfer, the lack of any prior public record of the debt Marsh claimed Thomas owed, and the copy of the deed Thomas had made, which contradicted the version now registered in the county land office. What was registered in the county land office was almost certainly a forgery, or at minimum, a document that had been misrepresented to Thomas about its contents. She had also, she told Cecil, been collecting testimonies. Not in a formal legal sense, but in the quiet way information moved through her apothecary. People trusted their healers with things they did not tell their neighbors. Gerald Fenwick and his water rights. Clara and Jim Morse and their land. A miner named Pete Donahue who had sold his claim to Marsh under circumstances that had left him feeling, as he put it, like I walked into a trade and didn't know what I was trading until it was already gone. 3 different people with 3 variations of the same story. Marsh has a pattern, she said, and a pattern can be proven. Cecil had been quiet for most of her explanation, which she appreciated. Men who talked over her while she was explaining something were an immediate and reliable indicator of incompatibility. "You need to go to the county seat," he said when she finished. "Pueblo, that's 2 days' ride." "I know." Marsh has ears along the road. His lawyer, Beaumont, travels it regularly. "If he knows you're going to the county courthouse with this, then I travel in a way he doesn't anticipate," Hazel said. "I don't take the main road. I go up through the ridge trail and come down the other side of the mountain." Cecil looked at her. "That trail is not passable in January." "I know the trail," she said. "You've been on the ridge trail in January. I've been on it in November and December. I go up there to collect certain plants that only grow at altitude, and I've gone twice since the snow started to make sure I still know the route. It's passable if you know where the drifts are and you don't do anything foolish on the ice shelf above the second draw." Cecil Blackwell stared at her. It was a different kind of staring than the sharp, assessing look he'd arrived with. This was the stare of a man who had just received information that recalibrated something he thought he understood, and she recognized it because she had made a small study of that particular expression over her years of doing things people didn't expect her to do. "You've been going up the ridge trail alone," he said. "Yes." "In winter." "Yes." "That is a genuinely dangerous trail, Miss Norris." "Most worthwhile things are. I take precautions. I know the terrain. And the plants I collect there are the only reliable source of the compounds I need to treat the kind of respiratory infections that kill people in this valley in January. So yes, I go up the ridge trail in winter." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know the trail better than I thought anyone did." "I grew up in the mountains," she said. "Not these mountains, but mountains. Colorado is not my first winter at altitude." "Where are you from?" "Montana originally. My father was a surveyor. I spent half my childhood on trail routes that weren't supposed to be passable." Something in his expression shifted. Not the steel wall, but the thing behind it, a recognition. "The ridge trail still has ice on the north approach above the 3rd stand of fir," he said slowly. "And there's a new drift across the south face from a blow we had last week that wasn't there in December." She realized what he was doing. He was comparing notes. "How do you route around the drift?" she asked. "Come off the trail 30 yards before the granite outcrop. Follow the elk track south, rejoin the trail at the top of the second draw. Adds maybe 20 minutes. She pulled out a small leather-bound notebook and wrote it down. He watched her write with that expression she was beginning to identify as his version of being thrown off balance. "You're very organized," he said. "I'm a pharmacist. Organization is survival." "I'm going with you to Pueblo," he said. It was not a question, but it also, she noted, was not framed as a command. It was framed as a statement of what was going to happen, and he left just enough space after it to be corrected. She considered it. She was not going to refuse help on principle when the help was genuinely useful. "The roads will be better traveled by 2 than by 1 in January," she said, "and having you in Pueblo with me strengthens the legal standing considerably. Your name carries weight as Thomas's heir." She paused. "There are conditions." "Name them." "You follow my lead in the courthouse. You do not decide to resolve anything with your fists in Ridgecrest between now and when we leave, because if you give Marsh a reason to have you jailed before we can file the complaint, this whole effort collapses. And you do not ride up to his property tonight." A very long pause. "I was thinking about riding up to his property tonight," Cecil admitted. "I know." "How?" "Because you came down the mountain in January," she said, "which tells me what you were prepared to do." And the fact that you're sitting on that stool and listening to me instead of demanding I hand over the paper and step aside tells me you're smarter than you were planning to be when you rode into town. I'm trying to keep you alive and get justice for your brother. Those two things require the same strategy." She watched him breathe. She watched him take the anger, which was considerable and entirely justified, and do something with it that was not the obvious thing. "All right," he said finally. "All right," she agreed. He stayed that evening. Not in the apothecary, which would have been inappropriate in the way that the year 1883 considered many useful things inappropriate, but Marcus Cole's smithy had a back room where travelers sometimes slept, and Marcus, who had clearly decided Hazel Norris was good for the town, and that her endeavors therefore deserved support, let Cecil have it without too many questions. Hazel did not sleep well that night. She sat up reviewing her notes, the collected testimonies, Thomas's copied deed, the timeline she had constructed across 4 months of quiet investigation. She was not afraid exactly. She was the particular kind of vigilant that preceded action, when the mind kept turning everything over to make sure nothing had been missed. She was also, and she was honest with herself about this too, thinking about Cecil Blackwell, specifically about the moment he had stopped arguing about the Ridge Trail. Most men she had encountered responded to being told she had done something they considered beyond her capabilities with one of two reactions: disbelief or a patronizing revision of their estimation of her. Cecil had done neither. He had gone quiet in the way people went quiet when they received information that was simply, plainly true, and then he had adjusted his map accordingly, and then he had started trading information with her, the drift route, the third stand of fur, the ice shelf, contributing to a shared picture of the terrain rather than trying to claim superior knowledge of it. It was a small thing, maybe, but small things told you the most. She finally slept around midnight, and she dreamed of mountains. The following 3 days were the most complicated of Hazel's time in Ridgecrest, which was saying something. Cecil came to the apothecary at dawn, arriving before she had finished her morning preparations, with the quiet patience of a man accustomed to measuring time in seasons rather than hours. He ate the biscuits she offered without comment, drank the coffee she brewed without ceremony, and asked clear practical questions about the plan without trying to revise it. They had one conversation on the second morning that she kept coming back to. She had been measuring out a compound for old Mrs. Delaney's arthritis, working quickly and precisely, and Cecil had been watching her the way he watched most things, steady and without pretense, and he had said, "Thomas told me about you." Glanced up from the scale. Did he? He said the woman who ran the apothecary was the sharpest person in Ridgecrest, and that talking to her made the rest of the town seem like a slower place. She had felt something warm and complicated at that. She had redirected it into measuring powder. Thomas was kind. Thomas was honest, Cecil said. Kindness was secondary. He didn't say things he didn't mean. He paused. "He wrote to me in September, after you arrived," he said. Cecil stopped. "What?" "He said he thought you were exactly the kind of person worth coming down from the mountain for." The silence that followed that had a different quality from the others. It was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that held something fragile in it. "He sounds like he was a remarkable person," Hazel said, and she meant it without agenda. "He was the best of us," Cecil said simply. She looked at him then full on and saw what was behind all that stone and silence. The grief was enormous, and it was clean. He had loved his brother with the uncomplicated ferocity of someone who had no other close attachments in the world. And losing Thomas had taken something out of him that was not coming back, and he was carrying it, the way mountains carried their load, without complaint, without release, holding it because putting it down was not an option. She thought about how isolated he was up on that ridge. She thought it was probably the loneliest kind of strength she had ever encountered. "What brought you down?" she asked, because they had been orbiting around it. She knew he had learned something, or heard something, or something had broken through the wall of the mountain winter to reach him. Pete Donahue came up in December," Cecil said. "He had no business going up the ridge in December, but he came anyway, because he said someone ought to tell me that Miss Norris at the apothecary was sending letters out that weren't being answered, and she was sitting alone on something that was going to get her in trouble." He looked out the window at the frost-white street, and because he'd talked to her and he thought she might be right about Thomas. So it had been Pete Donahue who had sent him down, but it was her name, carried up the mountain by a miner who trusted her, that had been the actual reason. She filed that away. She continued measuring. They were careful in those 3 days. Hazel kept her routine unchanged, opening the apothecary at her usual hours, treating patients with her usual focus, giving Everett Marsh no indication that anything was different from the status quo of her quiet and apparently unsuccessful investigation. Cecil, for his part, stayed largely out of sight, which was a considerable undertaking for a man of his dimensions, but he managed it with the woodsman's understanding of how to be present without being visible. It was on the 3rd morning that Marsh made his move. She should have anticipated it. In retrospect, she had anticipated something like it, which was why the document copies were stored in 2 locations, not one, with one set in the false bottom of her medicine chest and a duplicate locked in a metal box buried under the floorboards in the back room of Marcus Cole's smithy. Marsh sent 2 men into the apothecary while she was out on a call to the Morse Ranch, where Jim's cough had turned genuinely serious. She had taken her medicine bag but not the medicine chest. She had taken the false bottom key with her, which was habit. So when the men searched the apothecary, which they did with thorough and professional efficiency that suggested they had done this kind of thing before, they found nothing. They did, however, help themselves to 3 months of her revenue, which was kept in the small lockbox under the counter. She came back to the ransacked shop and stood in the doorway for a moment, reading what had happened in the displaced bottles, the pulled-out drawers, the lock on the medicine chest clearly examined and replaced imperfectly. None of her bottles had been broken, which told her the men had been specifically looking for documents, not generally destructive. She went straight to Marcus Cole's smithy. Cecil was on his feet before she had finished describing what she'd found. That dangerous stillness of his was vibrating with something different now, something that did not look like patience. "I need you to stay still," she said. "They went through your shop," he said, "and found nothing. Which means we need to leave for Pueblo today, not the day after tomorrow. The fact that they searched means Marsh knows or suspects what I have, and the window before he moves more aggressively is closing." Marcus Cole, who had listened to all of this from the corner of his smithy with the expression of a man watching a chess game he was only now fully understanding, said, "I can get you 3 horses ready in an hour. Good horses. Not mine, but I know where to get them without it looking like a departure." 2 horses, Hazel said, "and yes, please." She repacked the medicine bag with the essentials she needed for the ride, added the metal box with its duplicate documents, checked her small personal weapon, a single-shot Derringer she had owned since she was 19 and had learned to use competently in the way she had learned everything competently. By practice until she was satisfied, pulled her heavy wool traveling coat from its hook, and was ready in 40 minutes. Cecil came around from where he had been saddling the horses and stopped when he saw her fully prepared, the medicine bag strapped, the coat buttoned, her dark hair pinned under a wide-brimmed hat, her jaw set with the particular expression she wore when she had decided on a course of action and was committed to it past second-guessing. He looked at her for a moment. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Let's go." But she had seen what had moved across his face. It was not nothing. They took the ridge trail at a pace that was aggressive given the conditions and entirely justified given the circumstances. Hazel rode Prudence, who was experienced enough with altitude terrain to be trusted in the difficult sections, and Cecil rode a roan that Marcus had procured, a larger animal with the short, powerful stride better suited to the heavy snow. On the ice shelf above the second draw, Hazel's mare found solid footing without being directed, which was the kind of thing that happened when a horse trusted its rider and the rider knew the trail. Cecil came through the same section 30 seconds behind her, and he watched her route through it with the attentiveness of someone updating their mental map. "You were right about her knowing the trail," he said when they had cleared the shelf. "I told you." "I believed you," he said. "I was just also watching." That small distinction lodged in her chest somewhere. They rode for most of the first day without much conversation, which was comfortable in a way that absence of conversation between people who do not know each other well usually is not. It was the comfortable quiet of two people who were both paying attention to the same landscape for the same reasons. At a frozen creek crossing in the early afternoon, where a snow bridge had formed over the ice and needed to be tested before crossing, Hazel dismounted, pulled a long stick from the brush, and began probing the snow bridge systematically from the bank before stepping out onto it, which was exactly the correct procedure. Cecil had dismounted as well and was watching her work the probe stick with a practiced economy of motion that told him she had done this many times before. "You learned to read snow bridges," he said. It was not quite a question. "Montana mountains, remember," she said, probing the far edge of the bridge and finding it solid. "My father taught me." "Lead your horse across first. The weight will tell you if it holds." They crossed. It held. By the time they made camp that night in the lee of a granite shelf that Cecil knew and she had not, they had traversed the most difficult section of the ridge trail and were on the descending path toward the eastern valley that would eventually connect to the main road to Pueblo. The immediate danger of being followed over the ridge was behind them. Cecil made the fire with the swift competence of a man for whom fire-making in the cold was not a skill but an instinct, and Hazel produced dried beef and hardtack from the saddle bag, and a small tin of coffee, and they ate in the firelight without fuss. "Tell me about Montana," he said. So she did. She told him about her father's survey work and the camps that moved with the seasons and the way she had grown up knowing land as something you moved through and read rather than something you owned. She told him about her mother, a woman of considerable intellectual force who had run a boarding school in Helena for 10 years and who had taught Hazel mathematics, Latin, basic legal principles, and the understanding that intelligence was a tool and tools required practice. She told him about coming south, about St. Louis and Dr. Price, about the years of learning compounding and botanical medicine and the careful science of healing. He listened without interrupting, which was still the thing she most appreciated about him. "Your turn," she said. He told her about Virginia, where he had grown up, and the farm that had been destroyed in the years after the war, and the decision to come west at 20, with Thomas, who was 15, because there was nothing to stay for. He told her about the years of building the homestead, the cabin on the ridge, the choice of solitude that had not been entirely a choice at first but had become, over time, a genuine preference. "Does it get lonely?" she asked. A pause. "Yes," he said, "but you stay." "I stayed," he said. He looked at the fire. "I'm not certain I'd stay now with the same conviction." She did not ask him to explain that. She thought she understood it without asking. She slept well that night under the wool blanket she had brought, with the fire between her and the cold and the sound of the horses shifting in the snow nearby, and she woke to Cecil already up and coffee already made and the early gray light beginning to define the peaks above them. "How long before we hit the main road?" she asked. 3 hours, he said. They made it in 2.5. Pueblo was a different kind of world from Ridgecrest. It was larger and louder, a real city by the standards of the Colorado frontier, with brick buildings and a proper courthouse, and more people in its main street at midday than Ridgecrest had in its entire population. They rode in on the afternoon of the second day, both of them worn from the trail but not diminished by it. They found a hotel, 2 separate rooms, not because it required stating, but because it simply was what it was, and Hazel immediately began reviewing her documents at the small desk in her room, checking everything, arranging the testimony records in the order that would make the strongest sequential argument. They were at the county courthouse the next morning when it opened. The county attorney, a man named Wallace Creed who had the look of someone who spent a great deal of time waiting for things to disappoint him, received them in his office and listened with the expression of a man calculating the trouble a case would require versus the trouble ignoring it would create. Hazel presented everything with methodical precision. The timeline, Thomas's copied deed. The discrepancy between what was filed in the county land office and what Thomas had recorded in his own hand. The testimonies of Fenwick, Morse, and Donahue, each of them describing a similar pattern of coerced or misrepresented transactions. The suspicious timing of Thomas's death, which she laid out clearly without making claims she could not support, noting the absence of any prior illness, the impossibly swift progression of the supposedly fatal fever, the land deed signed 3 days before death, and the death certificate signed by a physician with a financial relationship to Everett Marsh. She asked for 3 things: a formal investigation into the land deed transfer, an order for exhumation of Thomas Blackwell's remains for independent examination, and a request for the county marshal, who was distinct from and superior to the local marshal in Ridgecrest, to investigate the conduct of one Marshal Haynes. Creed looked at the documents. Then he looked at Cecil. "You're the deceased's brother." "I am," Cecil said. "You're prepared to submit testimony?" "Yes." Creed tapped the copied deed against his desk several times in the way of a man thinking through the political architecture of a decision. Then he said, "Miss Norris, I want to be direct with you. Everett Marsh has significant interests in this county. The investigation you're requesting is going to be uncomfortable for a great many people who are currently comfortable." "Yes," Hazel said. "I know it should be." Creed looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "The deed copy on its own would be difficult to press, but the pattern across multiple transactions is harder to dismiss. Give me 2 days to review the land office records against your copies." "You'll find discrepancies in at least 2 other documents," Hazel said. "I've noted the likely ones in my written summary." Creed picked up her written summary, flipped several pages, looked at the precision of her organization, and said dryly, "How long did you say you've been in Ridgecrest?" "4 months," she said. "Good Lord," Creed said and reached for his pen. "They spent 2 full days in Pueblo." Creed's review found the discrepancies where Hazel had predicted them. The county marshal, a man named Garrett Cross who had the compact efficiency of someone who had seen a great deal and was not surprised by it, agreed to ride to Ridgecrest with a deputy to take Haynes into custody for questioning. The exhumation order was signed by a district judge who looked at the evidence with the expression of a man doing arithmetic and not liking the total. On the second evening in Pueblo, Hazel and Cecil ate dinner at the hotel dining room, which was the most genuinely civilized meal either of them had eaten in some time. There was a tablecloth. There was bread that was not hardtack. There were candles. Cecil had cleaned up from the trail, shaved the frost from his beard to a closer trim, and wore a clean shirt that Marcus Cole had apparently insisted he take. He looked different in a warm room, less like a force of nature and more like a person, and she found she liked the person at least as much as the force. "You're pleased," he observed. "I'm satisfied," she said. "There's a distinction." "What's the distinction?" "Pleased is an emotion. Satisfied is a conclusion." "I'm satisfied that we have done everything correctly and that the wheels of a legitimate process are moving. Whether I'm pleased depends on what happens next." "What do you think happens next?" Considered her wine. "Marsh learns we went to Pueblo, which he probably already knows. He has a day, maybe 2, before Garrett Cross arrives in Ridgecrest. In that window, he will either attempt to run or attempt to destroy evidence. If he runs, we lose the criminal case, but the civil case for the land is already established in the documents. If he tries to destroy evidence, Cross will have enough to take him into custody. And Albright is the weak point in Marsh's structure," she said. "A physician who signed a fraudulent death certificate faces losing his license and possible criminal charges." He'll cooperate with the investigation because cooperating is his only path to a reduced consequence. I expect him to tell the truth about Thomas once he understands he has no other viable option." Cecil looked at her across the candle-lit table. He looked at her in a way that was different from the assessing looks of the first day, different from the trail observations, different from any of the looks so far. It was quieter. It was the way someone looked when they had stopped trying to evaluate something and had simply decided on it. "You're remarkable," he said. He said it matter-of-factly, the same tone he used for everything, without decoration. She felt the warmth again, the same warmth she had been redirecting for 3 days. She let it stay this time. "I'm practical," she said. "Those aren't mutually exclusive." "No," she agreed, "they're not." The silence this time was different from all the others. It did not have weight, it had possibility. "When this is finished," Cecil said, choosing his words with the same care he chose everything, "I'd like to have dinner with you again, in a context that isn't a legal crisis." She looked at him. He held her gaze with that directness that was becoming one of her favorite things about him. He was not asking her to be something she wasn't. He was not offering to simplify her life or asking her to simplify his. He was just asking for dinner. "I think I would like that," she said. They rode back to Ridgecrest the following morning, taking the main road rather than the Ridge Trail, as speed was more important than secrecy now that the county's legal machinery was in motion. They arrived to find the town in the particular kind of agitation that small communities develop when something large has shifted in their power structure. Garrett Cross and his deputy had arrived half a day ahead of them. Marshal Haynes was in custody, taken from his office with minimal resistance, which suggested that Haynes had known this moment was coming and had not possessed sufficient loyalty to Marsh to face prison on his behalf. Everett Marsh himself had not run. This surprised Hazel briefly until she thought it through. Marsh was the kind of man who had survived because he believed in his own construction of events. He was in his saloon when Cross arrested him, and he was stating, loudly, that he intended to have his lawyer Beaumont make short work of these accusations by morning. He seemed genuinely not to understand that the architecture of his carefully built scheme had been examined by someone who understood architecture. Dr. Albright was a different matter. When Cross came for him, Albright opened his door before the knock was finished, which told the whole story about how he had spent the past 24 hours. He confirmed everything. Thomas Blackwell had been well when he visited Miss Norris on the morning of October the 18th. Albright had been paid by Marsh to list the cause of death as fever. He had not examined the body in any detail. He was extremely sorry. He was prepared to testify. The exhumation took place 2 weeks later, conducted by a physician from Pueblo named Dr. Samuel Hart, and the findings were precisely what Hazel had suspected. The cause of Thomas Blackwell's death was not fever. It was strychnine poisoning, consistent with a large dose administered in food or drink, which produced a rapid progression of symptoms that could be misread, by someone sufficiently motivated to misread them, as the final hours of a severe illness. It was a dark and ugly truth, and it answered the question that Cecil had not asked aloud but had carried down the mountain with him. Hazel told him in her apothecary in private, because some information deserved privacy. He sat with it for a long time. She did not rush him. He didn't suffer long. Cecil asked finally. "Strychnine is swift," she said gently. "Thomas would not have been conscious for most of it." Cecil nodded once. His jaw was tight and his eyes were bright, and she watched him take that terrible thing and do what he had done with all the other terrible things. Find the still place inside the storm and hold it there. "You knew this was what you'd find," he said. "I suspected it from the beginning," she said. The timeline was too precise. The healthy man in the morning and the dead man by dawn. Poisoning was the most logical conclusion, and the pattern of Marsh's other activities suggested he was willing to use extreme methods when slower ones were insufficient. "He sent 3 men with the lawyer," Cecil said. "They were the threat. Thomas signed because of the threat. Then they poisoned him anyway." "Yes, he was a witness to his own coercion. That made him dangerous to Marsh." My brother was a good man who built something honest and someone killed him for a piece of land. Yes, she said. That is exactly what happened, and the person who did it is going to stand in a courtroom and answer for it. The trial of Everett Marsh was set for the following spring in Pueblo. Marsh's lawyer, Beaumont, was good and well-funded, but the evidence was better, and Hazel had spent 4 months building a case that was not designed to be dismantled by a skilled attorney. It was designed to be dismantled and survive the dismantling, because she had anticipated every challenge before she had written a single sentence of her complaint. The trial lasted 4 days. Hazel testified for most of one afternoon, presenting her documentation with the steady precision that made the opposing lawyers' attempts at confusion look, as Ruth Alderman later described it to the entire population of Ridgecrest, like watching a man try to push water uphill. Albright testified. The 2 men who had accompanied Marsh's lawyer to Thomas's homestead on the night of October the 18th testified, having each independently decided that the smartest path forward was to place the order for the poisoning squarely where it belonged, at Everett Marsh's feet. The land fraud victims testified about their transactions. Cecil testified about his brother with a quiet, terrible clarity that left the courtroom without a sound. Marsh was convicted of murder, land fraud, and 3 counts of deed forgery. He was sentenced to hang, and he was hanged in Pueblo on a morning in April when the mountains were just beginning to clear their snow from the lower slopes. Hazel heard about it 2 days later from Marshall Cross's deputy, who rode into Ridgecrest with the news. She was in the apothecary, compounding a batch of willow bark preparation for the spring headache season, and she stopped what she was doing and stood at the window for a moment, looking at the sky. Justice was a real thing. She had always believed that in principle. It was different and more weighty to see it in practice. Thomas Blackwell's land was returned to Cecil by court order. The cabin on the North Ridge sat empty, and Cecil would eventually sell it, not because he wanted money from it, but because he could not manage the feeling of it standing there vacant in the landscape where his brother had lived. He sold it to the Morse family, who needed the extra ground, and he thought Thomas would have liked that. What happened between January and April, between the first morning Cecil had sat on the small stool in Hazel's apothecary, and the spring afternoon when the trial was finished, was quieter and more private than the public events of the investigation, but it was in many respects the most significant story. They had dinner 3 times in the weeks after returning from Pueblo. The first dinner was at the hotel in Ridgecrest, awkward in the way that first proper social occasions are awkward when the relationship has so far been conducted under conditions of high stakes and practical urgency. They were discovering, over a dinner that did not involve a legal crisis, that they simply liked each other. Cecil talked more than she had initially expected. The mountain silence was a mode he inhabited when it suited him, not a permanent state. He had opinions about literature, formed from the library of books he kept in the Ridge cabin, and those opinions were surprising in their breadth. He had read Darwin and was working through a complicated personal accommodation of what it meant for the things he believed. He knew more mathematics than was strictly necessary for a man who lived alone on a mountain, because mathematics, he said, was the language the landscape used when you were paying close enough attention. She had not expected that. She had expected a man of physical skill and practical knowledge, which he was, but not the particular quality of his mind, which was the kind of mind that could not leave interesting questions alone. It matched something in her own mind that she had not had a suitable conversation partner for in 4 months. The second dinner they talked about medicine and the state of what was known and not known about the human body in 1883, and Cecil asked questions that demonstrated genuine engagement with the subject, not the polite questions of someone pretending interest, but the sharp practical questions of someone building actual understanding. He asked about the mechanisms of the botanical compounds she worked with, what specifically in the willow bark reduced fever, how the body processed different substances, what the limits of current diagnostic knowledge were. "You think like a scientist," she said. "I live in a system," he said. "The mountain is a system, everything connected to everything else. You learn to think in systems up there. Medicine is a system too," she said, "or it should be. It's not always treated that way. Because people want the mystery," he said. "Mystery is more comforting than mechanism sometimes. Do you find that true for yourself?" He considered it. "I used to," he said. "Less now." He looked at her. "Knowledge is better than mystery, even when the knowledge is harder." She thought about Thomas. "Yes," she said, "even when." The third dinner ended with them sitting on the bench outside the apothecary in the cold, clear evening, which had not been the plan but had become the plan when neither of them wanted the evening to end. And Cecil had said, very carefully, that he had been thinking about the Ridge cabin with a different set of considerations than he had before, and she had understood what he meant without him saying the full thing, which was that the solitude that had sustained him for years was beginning to feel, in a very specific way, like the wrong kind of aloneness. "I'm not leaving Ridgecrest," she said. She said it with clarity and without apology because it was necessary to be clear about. "I built something here. The town needs what I provide. I'm not walking away from my own work for any reason." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to." "What are you asking?" He looked at the dark hills above the town. "I'm asking if there's something worth thinking about," he said, "between us. I'm asking in full knowledge that you are a person who makes her own determinations and doesn't require my endorsement of them. I'm just asking if it's worth thinking about." "It's worth thinking about," she said. He nodded. The stars were very clear. The temperature was dropping the way it dropped in January at altitude, with a precision that was almost personal. "You should go inside," he said. "It's cold." "I'm aware," she said without moving. They sat in the cold for another half-hour. Spring in Ridgecrest came in stages, as it always did at altitude, teasing and retreating before it finally committed. The snow gave back the lower slopes in April and the upper ones in May, and the aspens put out their first leaves with the tentativeness of the newly recovered, and the whole valley filled with the particular smell of cold earth warming back into life. Cecil began coming down from the mountain with more regularity. Not every day, and not in a way that altered who he fundamentally was, because Hazel would not have wanted it to. He came because he wanted to, which was the difference between a man who modified himself for love and a man who simply found that the gravitational field of his life had shifted somewhat. He helped her expand the apothecary. She had been thinking about a larger preparation room, and he had the woodworking skills to build the shelving and benches she needed, and they spent 2 Saturdays in May working on it together, which was one of the more unexpectedly satisfying things either of them had done in recent memory. She had precise standards about the construction of working surfaces in a medical setting, based on principles she explained as she explained everything, with complete information and clear reasoning, and he listened and adapted and executed with a craftsmanship that met her specifications exactly. "You're very particular," he said, on the second Saturday, with a tone that she had learned to read correctly as admiration. "My medications are compounded on these surfaces," she said. "Precision in the surface produces precision in the work." "I understand," he said. He did. He had built his cabin with the same principle applied to different specifications. "Tell me what else you need." Ruth Alderman noticed. Ruth Alderman noticed everything, and she was, as it turned out, quite pleased about it, having decided within her first month of knowing Hazel Norris that the woman deserved a man who was worth her time, and having decided within her first conversation with Cecil Blackwell after his return from Pueblo that he was, improbably, that man. "Everyone is talking," Ruth informed Hazel on a Tuesday morning in May with the satisfaction of someone delivering good news. "I know," Hazel said. "They're saying he was up here until midnight last Saturday." "We were discussing the roof repair on the back room," Hazel said, "for 4 hours." "Roof repairs are complicated," Hazel said, And Ruth laughed the way you laughed when someone was not fooling you but was doing it endearingly. On a warm evening in early June, Cecil brought her wildflowers from the ridge. Not a bouquet in the conventional sense, but a collection of specimens he had gathered because he knew she used high-altitude botanical plants in her work, and he had labeled each one in his careful handwriting with the location and altitude where he had found it. It was the most practical and the most romantic thing anyone had ever given her. She looked at the little labeled bundles for a long moment. "You went back up the trail," she said. "I wanted to bring you something useful," he said. She looked up at him. He was watching her with the expression she had come to know well, the expression that was quiet and sure and not performing anything, just present. She kissed him. It was not a careful or calculating decision. It was simply the correct next thing, the way the resolution of a well-constructed argument was correct, not because it was planned but because it was inevitable given everything that had come before it. He kissed her back, which he did with the same quality he brought to everything, fully present, completely genuine, without pretense. When they separated, there was a long, lovely moment. "I've been thinking about that for some time," he said. "How long?" she asked. "Since the first morning, when you told me to sit down and then started explaining things." She laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere deeper than the social register. "Because I told you to sit down. Because you knew exactly what you were doing," he said. "And you were going to do it with or without me. And you looked at me like you'd already decided exactly what I was worth and found it satisfactory." He paused. I don't think anyone had ever assessed me that clearly before. He stopped, looking for the word. "What?" "It felt like being seen," he said. Instead of just looked at, she understood that. She understood it with the particular depth of someone who had spent years being looked at without being seen. "You see me too," she said, and that was true. He had done it from the beginning, from the first conversation, from the ridge trail notes and the snow bridge silence. He had looked at her and seen what was actually there, not what he expected or wanted to find. "That's the intention," he said. Summer in Ridgecrest was its own kind of beautiful. The high meadows above the tree line going green and wild. The lower valley fields bright with the industry of people working their land. Hazel and Cecil spent the long, warm evenings together with the easiness of two people who had navigated significant difficulty together, and found that they were well suited to each other under pressure, which meant they were well suited to each other, full stop. He told her about every trail on the ridge. She told him about every plant she worked with. He read to her from his books in the evenings, and she read him the medical journals she received from St. Louis, and they debated the contents of both with the intellectual engagement of two minds that were genuinely interested in each other's thinking. He asked her to marry him on a September afternoon on the ridge, above the tree line, in a high meadow where you could see the full sweep of the valley below and the mountains in every direction, and where the aspens were beginning their first suggestion of gold. He had clearly thought about when and where with the same care he thought about everything. He had brought her up the trail she knew better than he'd initially expected, and he had not made it a surprise in the conventional sense, but had told her the night before, quietly, that he wanted to take her up to the ridge in the morning, and that he had something he wanted to say. So she had known in the way you know a thing before its formal confirmation, and she had still felt everything when he actually said it. He said it simply, without elaborate preparation. He said he loved her in the complete specific way of a man describing something real rather than performing a feeling. He said she was the most remarkable person he had encountered in his life, and that he did not use the word remarkable lightly, because he had spent 6 years on a mountain that demonstrated remarkable things daily. He said he had no interest in diminishing what she had built or changing the nature of who she was, and that he wanted to build something with her that made room for everything both of them were. She said yes. She said it standing in the September meadow with the gold aspens moving in the high wind, and the valley spread below them like a map of everything that had brought them here. And she felt it settle into her the way the best decisions settled. with a certainty that was not the absence of complexity, but the resolution of it. They were married in October, in the Ridgecrest church that doubled as a schoolroom, with Marcus Cole standing as witness and Ruth Alderman crying into her good handkerchief with unashamed satisfaction, and most of the town in attendance, because most of the town had a stake in this story in one way or another, having lived through its public chapters, and felt the difference it had made to Ridgecrest's particular version of justice. Pete Donahue, in the front pew, had the expression of a man whose December ride up an icy mountain had turned out to be among the more consequential decisions of his life, which gave him a visible and entirely justified satisfaction. Cecil kept the Ridge cabin. He would not sell it. It was, he said, part of who he was, and Hazel did not ask him to surrender that. They arranged their life the way practical people with genuine respect for each other arrange things, with discussion and negotiation and willingness to accommodate the real shapes of both their lives. They lived primarily in Ridgecrest, where Hazel's apothecary was, and it was her home and her work and the center of the life she had built. Cecil came down the mountain for the life with her in it, and went back up periodically for the particular kind of thinking and solitude that the ridge offered, because he was still the man who had chosen that ridge for reasons that remained real even inside a marriage. And sometimes, in the early mornings before Ridgecrest woke fully, she went up the trail with him, because she knew the trail, and because there was something in the high country that she loved too, the particular quality of altitude air and the way the world looked from above, and because hiking the ridge with Cecil Blackwell turned out to be one of the more satisfying ways to spend a morning that she had discovered. She was pregnant by December, which was the occasion of a great deal of congratulation from Ruth Alderman and a quiet, deep happiness from Cecil that expressed itself as a new kind of attentiveness, an already present watchfulness that had simply found a new object for its care. In the June of 1884, their son was born. They named him Thomas. It was not a difficult decision. Thomas Blackwell, the younger, arrived in the world with impressive lungs and his father's dark hair, and his mother's precise and suspicious study of the faces around him, which she found immediately and entirely charming. Cecil held him with the careful, controlled attention of a very large man handling something that required the opposite of force, and looked at the small face with an expression Hazel had not yet seen on him, something beyond all the previous expressions, something she did not have a word for because it was simply the specific look of a man who had lost his brother and gained a son and was holding both truths at once. "Hello, Thomas," Cecil said, very quietly. Ridgecrest kept growing. The silver production stabilized into something sustainable rather than spectacular, which was better for everyone than the boom and bust of the early years. New families arrived with the regularity of frontier expansion. Hazel's apothecary expanded twice, once for the larger preparation room Cecil had built, and once for a small examination room where she could see patients in something approaching proper clinical conditions. Her reputation spread beyond Ridgecrest, because word traveled in frontier communities about where you could get genuine and competent medical care, and she began receiving patients from outlying homesteads and small settlements within a day's ride, which meant she occasionally spent nights away from home on call. And Cecil, who had spent 6 years managing solitude with equanimity, managed these absences with the same equanimity, which she appreciated more than she said. She said it eventually. She was a woman who believed in saying true things. "I know it's not the conventional arrangement," she told him one evening after coming back from a 2-day trip to the Garrison homestead 20 miles north, where a difficult labor had required everything she knew and ended well. "No," he agreed, "it's better than conventional. Better. I know who you are," he said. "Every time you come back, I know exactly what you did and why it mattered. That's not a small thing." She came back to him every time with a feeling that was the specific feeling of returning to something real, something she had built deliberately, and that held its shape under pressure. He was there, the ridge above the valley, the lamp in the window she could see from the road before she reached the edge of town, the door that opened before she had finished tying the horse. 2 years later, they had a daughter. They named her Alina after Hazel's mother, which made Cecil smile in the particular way he smiled when something he could not have predicted arrived and turned out to be exactly right. Thomas, at 2.5, studied his sister with the same precise skepticism. Their mother had deployed against the world since before she could talk, which everyone in Ridgecrest agreed was one of the funniest things they had seen in some time. Cecil built Alina a cradle with the same craftsmanship he had applied to the apothecary shelving, with a smooth rocking action and enough structural integrity to survive the inevitable enthusiastic interest of an older sibling. Marcus Cole, who had stood at their wedding and helped them in the early crisis of January, and had become, over the years, something between a friend and an elder in their lives, came to see the baby and said with great simplicity that this was a fine outcome for a town that had needed one. For a town that had a woman willing to sit on the truth for 4 months until she could do something correct with it, Hazel said. Marcus considered this. Also that, he agreed. On the 5th anniversary of the January morning Cecil had come down from the mountain, Hazel found herself in the apothecary in the early afternoon, compounding a preparation she had made so many times it was as automatic as breathing, and she looked around at the room she had built, the precise shelves, the ordered bottles, the examination room through the inner door, and thought about where she had stood on that first September day, looking at the ink-stained floor and the bare walls. Calculating the work it would take to make something functional out of them. She was 31 now. Cecil was 36. Thomas was 4, and Alina was nearly 2, and the world they had built together was as real and solid as the granite of the ridge above town. She heard the door and looked up. Cecil came in from the cold afternoon, snowflakes from the first real storm of the new winter still melting in his hair and on the shoulders of the canvas coat, and he looked at her across the shop with the same quality of look he had given her on that first morning. The mountain man's direct, undisguised assessment, except that it held now everything that had happened in 5 years. The trail and the courthouse and the dinner with wildflowers and the October meadow and Thomas and Alina and every morning and evening between them. The snow's coming in fast, he said. I got down ahead of it. I know, she said. I was watching the sky. He came to the counter and leaned on it close enough that she could smell the cold mountain air on him. The children are at Ruth's, he said. She offered to take them for the afternoon. Did you ask her to? I may have mentioned I thought the storm was coming, she said. The corner of his mouth moved. You arranged it. I'm organized, she said. He took her hand across the counter, which he did with the same unhurried confidence of a man who had long since stopped being uncertain about the fundamental rightness of this particular person in his life. Outside, the snow was picking up, covering the main street of Ridgecrest in the clean white that came every winter, and the mountains above the town were disappearing into cloud, and the ridge where Cecil had lived alone for 6 years was somewhere up there in the white, patient and permanent. He had come down from that ridge in January for a woman who was smarter than he had expected and fiercer than anyone had warned him and more worth coming down for than he had adequate language to express. And the mountain would always be there, patient and available whenever he needed it. But the life in the valley was the life he had chosen, and he chose it every day with the full, intentional clarity of a man who had learned exactly what he valued by nearly losing the chance to have it. Stay inside tonight, she said. I was planning on it, he said. She smiled, and he smiled back, and outside the January snow came down over the mountain town in its impartial white abundance, covering everything equally, the grief of past years and the solid ground of the present. And inside the apothecary with its ordered shelves and its good work and its warmth, Hazel Norris and Cecil Blackwell stood together at the counter in the comfortable silence of 2 people who had found in each other exactly the right kind of home. Thomas and Alina came back from Ruth's at supper time, flushed from the cold and full of chatter about the snow, and Cecil swept Thomas up in his arms, and Hazel took Alina, and the family sat around the table in the back room of the apothecary, where they often ate when the weather was too rough for the house 2 streets over, and Hazel served the stew she had started that morning, and Cecil told Thomas a story about elk tracks on the ridge, and Alina conducted a serious investigation of her spoon. And the lamp made its warm circle against the winter dark outside, and everything that had been broken or hidden or taken was either healed or answered or returned, and the life that remained was the one they had built from honest material, and it held completely. It held the way mountains held, quietly and permanently, and it would go on holding for all the years that came after, through the good seasons and the hard ones, through the growth of the children into people of their own, through the expansion of the apothecary into a proper medical practice, and the expansion of Cecil's world from the mountain into the full and inhabited life he had not known he was capable of wanting until a woman in a frontier apothecary had told him to sit down and proceeded to change everything he understood about what coming down from the mountain could mean. January had been the month he had come down. January was also, from that year forward, the month they celebrated with particular warmth, lighting the lamp early and staying close to home, and remembering together the cold morning when everything had started, the frozen door and the ransacked silence before it and the frost in his beard, and the look in her eyes that had seen him clearly from the first moment and found him, against all her careful expectations, exactly what she had not known she was waiting for. They were not people who required poetry about their love. They were people who demonstrated it in the daily structure of their lives, in the apothecary organized with mutual understanding, in the trail they both knew, in the conversations that never ended but only paused, in the children sleeping down the hall who were made of both of them, in the mountain visible on clear days above the roofline of the town, patient as always, no longer lonely. The snow kept coming that night and into the next morning, and the world was very white and very still, and inside the warmth of the life Hazel Norris and Cecil Blackwell had made together, everything was exactly as it should be.